Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to try to make some comments here on sort of motivation and hit on three types of system science models that we'll be seeing in the context of this work. So much of us have worked for many decades using traditional approaches to yield scientific insight into the health domain in particular. And this approach it remains of profound value. It's yielded great insights into a variety of types of understanding at all levels of health, from the biomedical level up to the clinical level, up to the health service level, and up to the public health level. But over time, many health scientists have found that while they have a good understanding of the pieces, it's often in the integration between those bits of understanding that traditional methods need to be supplemented with additional tools. It's not a matter that they're out of date. It's not a matter that they don't offer value. They offer profound value, and they offer value that's especially great when combined with additional approaches. The types of understanding offered by randomized controlled trials, offered by studies of particular pathways through laboratory experiments, the types of insights that have come out from associational studies in very particular domains, or from biostatistical analyses of particular associations are great in their implications. But an increasingly strong realization in health is that much of the behavior we deal with in health, the persistence of troublesome persistence of STIs within core networks, for example, or of antimicrobial resistance, its emergence within the context of health service delivery, or emergence in infectious diseases like TB. Whether it's the syndemics we see between, on the one hand, chronic diseases like diabetes and communicable conditions such as TB, the emergence of confluence of factors that are on the social scale at the one hand, social side, and on the other hand, the health side, in areas such as suicidal ideation, opioid abuse within the North American context, etc. They have an entangling of a bunch of different factors that defy reduction to one particular pathway, one particular set of variables, one particular set of factors. They tangle together factors of many different sorts. When we think about opioid abuse, an area where I'm doing, particularly exciting work just recently. You're dealing with a confluence of health issues, criminal justice issues involving social service delivery, and health service delivery from a health perspective, because of the route of entry in many cases is through prescribing behavior, and many of the health outcomes more distally, lead to ED presentation, deaths from overdose, etc. But along the way, there's a lot of issues having to do with justice, a lot of issues having to do with social services that end up playing a big role. And people have long recognized that when we deal with systems, to understand a system, to understand its evolution over time, but more deeply to change its evolution in some desirable way, to bend the curve, as it were, from growing levels of antimicrobial resistance within the sphere of nosocomial infections. We need to understand more than the pieces. We need to understand the bigger system and how it behaves, not just with each piece in isolation, but for the system as the whole. A situation where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, or different than the sum of the parts. And just as, it's hard to understand traffic jams with knowledge that's purely about, the factors governing the grading of roads, or factors associated with mechanics of each car in isolation. Just as traffic jams transcend the knowledge about car in isolation, the knowledge about the road conditions in isolation, or psychology in isolation, it tangles together all of them. So it is with many of the health issues that we see, with new emerging infectious diseases, with syndemics of conditions, with health service delivery challenges. We're dealing with a set of different factors which interact in a way so that the whole yields behavior different than the parts. From the system science perspective, over many decades, scientists have cataloged sort of characteristics of system behavior that are distinctive. And in health, we've long been aware of some of these. For example, tipping points. We talk about herd immunity in health. It's a concept that is not purely reducible to each person, because, the population might be composed of many individuals, include many individuals who are susceptible to infection. We can talk about herd immunity as having been obtained for that population, despite the presence of those susceptible individuals. It's not about just the individuals, it's about the population as a whole being resistant to the introduction of a particular infection, because the infection cannot transmit with enough efficiencies to persist in that population. That's a property of the population. It's not a property of an individual in the population. Herd immunity is a systems level phenomenon. And we've long realized that we're at risk with waning rates of vaccination of going the wrong way on that tipping point, of reaching a situation where we may not reach herd immunity. We talk in the context of health about different phenomena, different levels of a system: neighborhood level, family level, individual level, regional level, where the dynamics is rather different. Now, within the health context, our work has spanned many areas. One of them we've worked on is STIs, sexually transmitted infections, from bacterial infections such as gonorrhea and chlamydia, over to viral infections such as HPV. And much of our work in this area was early done in the context of chlamydia, a bacterial infection of considerable prevalence within the Canadian context. And for many years, through strong efforts due to the healthcare delivery, particularly faster contact tracing, use of partner-assisted therapy, efforts made in terms of testing, the number of cases of chlamydia in Canada was coming down, and it was heralded as a significant public health success. We're able to achieve lower and lower levels incidence of chlamydia. But in the years since 97, in the decade since that, and in some years since this graph continued, there were rising rates of chlamydia, and many heralded this as a real adverse turn of events. That despite so much effort early on in the healthcare system and such success, the rates turned around and rose. And many used the term crisis or alert to sort of identify this period as requiring special priority and urgency. But looking more deeply, those commenting on the situation brought up a number of big questions. What's going on here? Why is it that we've seen this turnaround? What's driving it? How can we bend this curve? How can we drive things down again? But some even asked, is this good or bad news? Are the rates rising here reflective of actual rising underlying incidence, the number of people actually getting infected, or is this more a reflection of better and better reporting of those cases that are out there? Maybe the rates are rising here not because there's more people with chlamydia out there, not because the underlying incidence is in fact higher, but because we're just more efficient in finding those cases and bringing them in for treatment. Maybe what's going on here is I'm hesitant to use this term anymore because it has been tainted, but maybe we're draining the swamp here, of chlamydia, and by draining it, we're going to see lower rates in the future, and maybe this is a reflection of a greater efficiency in our public health system. Very simple case, but big questions being asked. And you note that all these questions are about, at some level, what's going on in the underlying system. If we take a look at our data and we try to make sense of this empirical data, we want to relate it in a meaningful way to what it tells us about what's happening beneath the covers, what's happening in the underlying dynamic that this is simply a reflection of or manifestation of. And all three of these questions have to do with that underlying dynamic. Dynamic either as currently realized in the first two, or dynamic as it may come to be in the case of interventions, often counterfactual interventions that haven't been tested yet, but which we could roll out. And with traditional techniques, the biostatistical techniques I know and love and practice regularly, whether it's competing risks analysis, survival analysis, recurrence events, logistic regression in a variety of contexts, etc. Techniques like that, traditional techniques for epidemiological investigations, give us great benefit, but they have limitations and challenges when it comes to certain contexts. When we have causally tangled issues, particularly involving health disparities across society, we have not just one condition that can be studied in isolation, but it's entangled with others in persistent ways. Obesity with H1N1, as we saw in 2009, 2010, for example. When we're trying to rigorously assess the drivers for the trends and the patterns that we see, why this is coming down and reversing course, we're trying to understand systems with reciprocal causality, cases where we know that there's vicious cycles operating, say between poverty on the one hand and health status on the other. Cases where reciprocal causality can be involved in terms of opioid addictions on the one hand and dysphoria and suicide attempts on the other. We have challenges with taking such systems apart with traditional statistical techniques and of reasoning on how they might evolve over time in the context of novel interventions and portfolios of interventions. Maybe we have a set of interventions, each of which has been tried before, but we want to put them together in ways that are unique. We want to bundle them, and we want to ask, what's the gain? Is it additive? Is it synergistic? So we get, you get not just the gain of both the sum of them, but you actually get something better than that. Is it possible that, from point of view of disequilibria, that we could reach a tipping point where, when it comes to obesity, and childhood obesity particularly, when it comes to diabetes, as a follow-on to that, when it comes to pertussis, is it possible that we can achieve a tipping point where we can qualitatively change the situation? When we want to reason about implementation science concerns, scale up, time to effect of interventions, if we want to prevent an infection from being declared a failure before it's really had time to realize its effect, before it's had time to play out in a meaningful way, we need to reason about the dynamics of the situation, not just what its long-term gain is, but about how it plays out over time. When do we expect to see these effects? How big will they be over time? And what are those trade-offs between interventions? If we want to reason about logistical challenges associated with training, for example, individuals to achieve the intervention, or sustainability in terms on the funding front. These are challenges on the implementation science side that have been elevated in recent years. Sometimes it's just a renaming of KT, knowledge translation, from earlier times. But people have highlighted that as a particularly key link in the chain of evidence that often traditional techniques need to be supplemented, and they don't fully realize on themselves. And anticipating behavioral responses to interventions. How will their behavior change in the context of novel policy regimes? Traditional scientific approaches have allowed us to understand these pieces, but we need to have some way of knitting together what's understood about these pieces into an understanding from the whole. And the risk here is if we try to make decisions without that understanding of the whole, we will risk running afoul to the underlying dynamics of the system, and we'll have policy resistance, cases where it falls short in terms of the gains. Whether we're dealing with diabetes and obesity or tobacco or many other issues, we have these layers of issues. Yes, there's kind of a biomedical level and sort of more narrowly detailed level where we might say, yeah, obesity is a risk factor for diabetes, and this is very important. Underneath that, there's complex regulatory processes involving feedbacks and lock-in effects, et cetera, that link these two. And if we want to think about an intervention that's going to have lasting change, as Jeff talks about, we want to put in place fixes that stay fixed. And we want to understand how soon we will see gains. Understanding some of these regulatory components is important. But at a broader level, we also know there's a big importance of environments, built environments, food environments, communicational environments associated with promotion of physies and promotions of less healthy forms of food. And there's also diverse actors involved. Consumers, retailers, store operators, agricultural producers, city planners, a whole weight loss industry, lobbyists, regulators, who are often pushing for certain types of arrangements or addressing the needs of their constituents. There's also the need to operate in an environment of shifting norms, attitudes, beliefs, and potentially syndemic interaction with other related conditions. Much of our work having been done in gestational diabetes, possible epigenetic components. With heart disease and tobacco, we again have biomedical level issues, but we have these layers of nesting which are important. A social component of smoking, neighborhood effects, availability of tobacco of certain types because of the regulatory environment. And Sandro Galea contributed this list, or much of it, in the context of one of his talks. He's the Dean of the School of Public Health at BU. And multi-time head of the the Society for Epidemiological Research in the U.S. and has articulated this as kind of an example of some of the different factors that come in with tobacco that point towards the need for systems approaches. So we have, not just biomedical level understanding, but understanding of the biology, but the economics of it, the actors again as well, the environment, etc. So here, people operating in the health space have sought to try to articulate different levels of environment interactions. This is from one of Sandro's contributions for the food system. Articulating the awesome level of complexity of the different issues addressing policymakers in the food environment, crossing over from science, technology, politics, and government to aspects of sociocultural environment, aspects associated with the particulars of sort of the biologic environment and the food system here in the food industry. So my colleague Shariki Kumnaikov of UPenn has articulated again in the food environment these kind of different levels of nesting that end up affecting obesity within the context. And the Foresight Institute in UK has also put out this kind of mind-bogglingly complicated set of networks that link together physiology, food consumption, food production, individual and social psychology, physical activity environment, and individual activity environment, along with physiological processes. The point of these is not to overwhelm or to highlight merely the complexity. It's to highlight the fact that we're dealing here with systems where the whole is not merely reducible to the sum of its parts. Just like with a traffic jam, the phenomenon of a traffic jam cannot merely be reduced to, the axle size of the vehicles involved or their horsepower of their engines or what have you. It involves psychology, it involves aspects of road design, it involves aspects of cars, yes, but many figures, many components tangled together. And with these systems, they exhibit emergent behavior that's surprising from the system as a whole. Surprising in the sense that we can't track it down to any one piece. It's not about this piece A, B, or C. It's about them all tangled together. And most importantly, if we want to change something here, we need to understand that emergence, because policies themselves are associated with surprising changes often. And policy-induced changes can cause ripple-through effects that are unanticipated and that may be contrary to what was sought. So within the health context, we have a large history of running afoul of some of these efforts. But in the health context, if you look at, for example, caloric expenditure and obesity, you'll find feedbacks complicate the reasoning in that area. Same thing with reasoning about drug effectiveness in the real world, where in the clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, some of the major factors being controlled for, being maintained as constant, good compliance or what have you, in the real world end up shaping in a major way the success, the real world effectiveness of an intervention. So when it comes to HIV drugs, the antiretroviral therapies that are used, we know that in the modern context, a lot of what shapes success of HIV interventions is in fact compliance that is controlled for in many randomized controlled trials. Application of narrow cost effectiveness criteria, which is attractive as a mode of analysis of the effectiveness of interventions, can also, when applied overly narrowly, can overlook key dynamics for communicable disease. There's been a great paper from Kimberly Thompson that appeared in The Lancet some years back showing that if one applies cost effectiveness too narrowly from a system science perspective, you can end up making decisions that are terribly non-cost effective in the long run, because one ceases to finish the job in, for example, vaccinating for polio when it becomes non-cost effective, and one leads to subsequent persistence of an infection that could have been eliminated by that finishing the job. Even though it's very expensive, you could have saved money at massive levels in the long run. So, within this context, there's two big needs that are often falling short, and where we need additional techniques. One is the need to address what's going on here. Does the evidence support my hypothesis? Does the empirical data really, is it supportive of my working hypothesis that I have in place? Where is the situation likely to go next? Where is this headed? Are we going to see rising rates of chlamydia on an ongoing basis, or is it pretty much maxed out? I remember talking with one of our regional health planners in the H1N1 situation, and him asking, we're seeing a downwards trend. Is that going to continue, or are we going to see a second peak like some cities are seeing? We need to know, because we need to get the health services in place. If we're going to see another peak, we need to free up the time of the nurses for the surge needs. What's driving the observed patterns, and is what I'm seeing even good or bad? We saw that with the chlamydia case. And this is complicated in the communicable disease front in ways that have been appreciated for centuries. This was from Brayley in 1700s reporting on bubonic plague in London and identifying this classic curve we now know is an epi curve associated with spread of communicable diseases and the exhaustion of a susceptible population, where it rises in number of incident cases and then falls, often precipitously. For childhood infectious diseases, we see these cyclical patterns before the introduction of vaccinations that are starting to emerge again for many of these conditions, at least in the North American context, because of waning vaccination rates. We see, interactions between multiple individuals. Say, if we consider mental health and infancy, these interactions between child well-being on the one hand and caregiver, such as maternal well-being, and on a mental health level, where postpartum depression on the part of a mother may risk adverse childhood mental health on the part of an infant, which then worsens the mental health prognosis for the mother. And even conditions like obesity have been fingered as having network effects associated with them, although the causes for these network effects are more contentious than was originally appreciated by the authors of this paper with Kostrakis and Fowler in the New England Journal of Medicine. In conditions like chlamydia, we see big disparities in the Canadian context in terms of burden of infection associated with socioeconomic gradients. Same thing with chlamydia and gonorrhea in Manitoba, where we have networks of spread that bring it from distant reserves and communities and smaller areas to the city and back. We have this coupling between areas. This is for rabies in the Connecticut context, where you see kind of concentric patterns of spread that are spatially mediated. And one of the big challenges here that I alluded to earlier in my buzzing, blooming confusion introduction was the fact that, if we theorize about underlying processes, what might be going on in the population, what might be happening to explain these phenomena, there's some dynamics that are implied by those hypotheses if they're precise enough. There's some implications for the behavior of the system that we should see if we posit this is going on. And we're interested in understanding the degree to which those theories are consistent with empirical observations. The problem is, if we only rely on informal reasoning, figuring out what dynamics are implied by a theory that's merely articulated in our head or merely articulated in longhand prose, is really challenging. Going from this theory where we think, well, okay, maybe this is what's going on, to is it consistent with the empirical data is very hard to assess. It's not clear to us what this dynamic implications are of this theory when we're reasoning about it in our heads. There's many factors tangled together, and many studies have demonstrated we're very poor at being able to detangle those features in a way that will tell us what their logical consequences are. John Sturman at MIT has conducted a variety of experiments with MIT STEM graduate students, some of the finest from around the country in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, who attend his courses. And he gives them very, very simple problems to reason about in their heads involving dynamics of a system. We're talking about something that, is 100 to 1,000 times simpler probably than that additional model we saw. It involves one stock and changes to the stock with certain flows. And time again, they show that actually there's lots of mistakes made, and even the simplest reasoning about the simplest system. And once one starts adding layers of complexity, the ability to really articulate what behavior should come out of a theory, particularly one that's not fully articulated because it's in our heads, it becomes utterly implausible. And so this is a big weakness when we come to complex systems, that we have difficulty taking a theory and turning it into expectations to test their consistency with empirical data. A second major need, though, beyond understanding what's going on, this first need, is the need to reason about the effects of counterfactual interventions. Where do we best intervene in a system? Is it at the level of screening and testing? Is it at the level of primary or secondary prevention, prophylaxis? Is it at the level of rendering faster treatment? Which target groups should we be focusing on? Is it groups distinguished by their involvement with the healthcare system? Is it groups such as pregnant women or individuals who have weaker immune systems? Which groups should we target? What are the trade-offs between these in terms of cost, trade-offs in terms of how soon we'll see an effect, trade-offs in terms of the extent of that effect, in terms of mortality, morbidity? How do we intervene best? How soon will we see effects? How to scale up this intervention from a smaller scale to a larger? How to translate it to rural and remote areas? How do we make this implementation financially sustainable for the long run in the chronic disease context? These are questions which we tangle with, and where, in the context of this complexity, network connections between individuals, bridging individuals between populations. This is our TB network from Saskatchewan. Actually, it's about a quarter of it that I was graphing out there. Cases where infection lives in certain area of the networks that we would have expected it to not be able to persist, but because of the behavioral characteristics of those subpopulations, it's able to persist. And we have situations where the tail wags the dog. Just a small fraction of the population ends up causing persistence of infection you might otherwise think will die out. So in this context, we have further challenges. So here, we're interested in theorizing about the underlying processes, but we're contemplating interventions that are going to change those processes. We may have certain observations about the world now, but we're talking about something which is changing, as we say, the data generating process. It's changing what's going on out there, and we're interested in trying to reason how does that change the dynamics of the system, and when we undertake the intervention, to what degree is our understanding of what's going on consistent with what we're observing over time, having put this intervention into place. When we, again, rely on informal reasoning, figure out what dynamics are implied, and to what degree we need to change our theory about the world, and thereby perhaps our intervention, refine our intervention, is difficult. Because we don't know what is expected in terms of the dynamics. We can't learn as quickly as we would from the empirical observations as the intervention plays out. We don't know against what guidelines should we be comparing this to know whether our understanding is well-grounded or whether we need to change our intervention plans. So we're a little bit flying blind without understanding the dynamics of the system. So traditional reductionist approaches in this sphere of health support good understanding of the pieces. And, they've traditionally we've pursued a reductionist strategy, and it's offered these insights, but it has fallen short in certain ways in terms of integrating them together to the whole, to a picture of the whole. And the question here is, in the words of Jeff, how do we create fixes that stay fixed here? How do we get on the right side of tipping points to establish changes that are qualitative in nature, just like we can achieve at the herd immunity level? How do we take into account in our planning the path-dependent effects of, for example, early childhood experiences that, just those first few years of life, the first 5 years of life, are so critical in setting trajectories for lifelong experiences, lifelong care needs, etc. How do we effectively make decisions that will take that into account and at the same time will be sustainable in the short run? How do we deal with the vicious cycles that bedevil our societies in terms of health disparities, despite much effort for equity in both the Canadian and Australian context? We're still dealing with gaping disparities that are based on socioeconomic positions, sometimes rural-urban divides on others, and that also troublingly co-vary with ethnic divisions within society. So here, we're with traditional techniques, we have these challenges with reasoning about these tangled pieces, multi-pathway, health ecosystems, reciprocal causality, life course effects, adaptation and learning on the part of individuals, shifts in behavioral norms. We've seen this with HIV, with the emergence of the antiretroviral therapy, some relaxation of behavioral norms related to transmission. But we've also seen it in some of the XDI contexts and others. We've seen it with the emergence of IT technologies like Tinder and so on for contact patterns. When we're dealing with feedbacks which complicate traditional reasoning and both upstream and downstream factors, it's really very difficult to learn from experience, to coordinate, plan, and decide, and to design effective healthcare systems. This was a from the far side. Bobby Milstein used this in one of his presentations, and I really liked it. Sometimes we jump out of one set of conditions and to try to flee, and we end up in a different bad straits. What a fine mess we've gotten ourselves into, as Mark Heffernan would sometimes say. We've put a lot of effort into antibiotics, and the pathogen has developed drug resistance. In the U.S. in the 1970s, big efforts based on the Surgeon General's report from the 60s, big efforts on the health harms associated with smoking. There are big efforts to lower tar in cigarettes. The thought being that, these carcinogens in the tars in cigarettes cause such health damage in the form of heart disease, emphysema, lung cancer, etc. If we can reduce tar levels, cigarette smokers will be spared so much harm. It will lower cancer rates, it will lower heart disease rates and mortality. And nowadays it's viewed as a big mistake because their focus was on, less risk to smokers, but they missed the effect in big ways on quitting and cessation. And a lot of individuals who might have quit instead ended up switching to low tar cigarettes. So they missed the cessation component, and as a result, they probably caused net harm, is the current belief. They actually caused net harm because many individuals who would have made that switch to a non-smoking situation, they ended up persisting in their smoking habits, fooling themselves into thinking that they were now engaging a much lower risk behavior, and ended up developing a lot of these conditions despite that. Nicotine levels in the U.S., there's a similar effort to lower nicotine levels in cigarettes for a while. The idea being we'll wean people off of their addiction. And what they missed there was the big effect of behavioral feedbacks. So individuals who had these lower nicotine cigarettes, for a given cigarette to be exposed to less nicotine, but to get the same buzz, they would smoke more cigarettes, or smoke them more deeply and more fully, to a more complete level. And as a result, it probably didn't have a big impact on reducing the burden of the complications of smoking. And in the U.S. context, there's big challenges associated with targeted anti-tobacco interventions leading to sort of pushback by tobacco by targeted coupons, many of them online these days, running circles around the regulators because the regulators are focused on traditional media and traditional distribution channels, and the tobacco industry is 2 steps ahead in taking advantage of online forums, online couponing in very targeted ways that are geographically targeted to undercut the efforts of the regulators. I could go on case after case. Anti-lock brakes to deal with this phenomenon that is known as snow, that perhaps you here have never experienced. When it comes to the efforts with improving qualities of water supplies, impacts of overly hygienic environments, etc., we risk policy resistance. Jeff likes to cite the example of King Canute, who was a king in think the late Dark Ages of England, sort of medieval, early medieval period, perhaps, where he tried to order back the tides, and the idea was that that his advisors told him that he was king of everything in his kingdom was under his command, and he said, no, it's not. There's certain things that are not under his command, and they said, yes, everything will obey you. So he to demonstrate the futility of their fawning, he sought to order back the tide, and of course the tide was not ordered back. It came in nonetheless. And the point here is we risk working at cross purposes with the nature of things unless we understand what's driving the underlying system, unless we understand what things are under control and what we can do about it to best bend them to our ends. We're going to end up like King Canute, swamped by the tide. We're going to end up, blowing against the wind. We're going to end up shooting ourselves in the foot. We're going to end up with policy resistance, situations where the system itself that's out there, the dynamics of the system defeat or dilute the interventions that we undertake. They, in some cases, might reverse the gains that we see, like with the tar cigarette. Now, the realization in system science here is that the patterns we see in the world, the patterns of data that we see, result from underlying processes that are only, for which we only secure limited visibility. We only have some ability to sort of directly probe those processes. And these processes that underlie what we observe are causally tangled often. They're tightly interrelated. And they interconnect with a lot of different factors. So while we might study from a epidemiological standpoint mortality patterns in isolation or contact patterns in isolation or natural history of infection in isolation for a particular pathogen, well, we might study transmission risks associated with different levels of prophylaxis. The fact is that these things are tangled together in the world. And the patterns that we see in terms of incidence reflect that tangling. To understand why patterns persist in the world and resist efforts to correct them, and how we have to change them, we need to reason about these processes giving rise. Otherwise, we risk, like King Canute, working across purposes with the nature of things, right? So system science is the science of a whole, which seeks to help us visualize, understand, reason about understanding regarding these underlying processes. Helps us take theories of the world and put them into a precise enough form that we can test their consistency with the evidence more quickly. This is not about theorizing as an alternative to evidence collection. This is about leveraging that evidence, making best use of it, choosing the evidence to gather in the most judicious fashion by reasoning about posited processes. And a central way in which system science operates, not the only way we'll see during this boot camp, but a central way is through dynamic models. Okay? We'll see another aspect of system science with state-space methods that will leverage our dynamic models. But dynamic models are the primary tool used by most practitioners within the system science area. And these models basically weave together representations of our hypotheses in a quantitative, precise fashion. And they help us link it to the understanding in terms of empirical evidence. They represent how things might work, not how they do work, but how they might work. Our positing our working hypothesis often about how things might work, so that we can reason through, identify inconsistencies, we can share the assumptions with others. And there's a set of hallmarks. For those of you using multiple approaches like I do, there's a set of hallmarks I look for. When someone brings me a problem, I get all sorts of problems brought by students, collaborators, etc., in different areas. And there's certain things I look for that highlight the need for simulation modeling, highlight the need for system science approaches. And this is kind of a little crib sheet of things that I ask about. wonder, okay, are there feedbacks operating here? Situations where change ripples around and leads to something that amplifies or pushes back against their initial change. Are there path dependence, things that occur early on that profoundly shape what goes on later in ways that change the effectiveness, say, of an intervention early compared to later? Are there things which, you have a stitch in time saves 9. We intervene early with a limited amount of effort, we can make a big difference later on. Compared to that same intervention later, it has only very small effect. We see this in childhood effects, right? Sometimes intervening early enough in life, we can head a problem off. Or we see it in treatment for things like syphilis, where it becomes a progressively worse condition, or TB to prevent it from becoming infectious and then cavitary in nature. Finding people early on makes a big difference for heading off bigger problems later. Are there interagent effects or big emergent patterns, effects of local environment or localized perception that we see, effects of scale, different effects at different scales, big effects of heterogeneity, not in the sense, it's complicated, there's many different subgroups, but more, are there certain aspects of that where there's certain subgroups that are particularly key need to address, that the tail wags the dog. Just that small group may make a big difference in shaping the outcomes for the broader society, like we see for STIs, for example, with core networks. Are there dynamic effects where over time you need to understand the dynamics that result from the system? Is that central to the needs? Is there adaptation and learning, kind of non-linearities where you combine two interventions, for example, and we see very different effects from the combination than the sum of what we get from each in isolation? Are there network effects of sort of evolving networks over time? So let's talk about these dynamic models. These models, I've noted several times, they represent hypothesized causal relationships regarding how diverse factors interact over time. I want to highlight several words in that sentence. They mimic or seek to mimic, seek to be a simplified sort of correspondent to certain things in the world. Hypothesize, things that we might posit to be the case, but we're not certain of it. Causal relationships, things that are playing out in the world in a causal fashion, not merely associational, but where if we change A, it leads to changes in B that are causal in nature. Okay, so it influences B in a fashion that we would term indicative of a causal change. Regarding how diverse factors, so often these models include many components in them, interact over time. We're simulating how the system as a whole and large pieces of it change due to changes at any one area of the system, for example, or at multiple areas of the system simultaneously. So it provides a way to examine how system-wide consequences of changes in one or more areas of the system. And these models help us and system actors identify vulnerabilities of a system, where it's vulnerable to certain changes through external factors or through adverse actors such as the food industry, tobacco industry, or what have you. Leverage points of a system, areas where policymakers can invest and gain great benefits. It can identify ways of fruitfully changing system structure, designing a system, and improve ways that different people in the system work together. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with it, I'll just note that these sorts of models go by many different names. And one of the challenges of working in this area, particularly over the past 20-25 years, has been that different subcommunities have very different names for things that are fundamentally at a deep level very similar and interlinked. So some call it a mathematical model. Others call it a causal model. So you have to be careful because this has different meanings in the biostatistical context these days. Some call it a model of the physics of the system, or a mechanistic model. It depicts causal pathways, posited causal pathways in the system. And the defining goal here is to try to examine dynamic behavior resulting from this causal structure. either with baseline situation or intervention situation. And we talk about how these models tend to depict kind of the physics of the system, in the sense of the causal structure of the system. And often they are associated with significant amounts of latent state, not just observable quantities, but underlying drivers for those quantities, which may be latent in the sense they're not directly observable. There are things that are hard to directly measure certain pieces of the system. Very importantly, they simulate the step-by-step evolution of the state of the system over time. Remember that model we ran this morning? We saw those little bowling pins moving around. It's simulating how the system evolves over time across the entire system. So at any one time, it's at a certain time, and we can run it, 1 year forward. It'll simulate that year. We want to run it 1 year further, and it's simulating how that whole system goes from year to year to year, similar to how time passes in the real world, right? We're simulating how that population changes, how people's weight profile changes, how their behavioral profile, how their environment changes, etc. And because we seek with this system to capture some elements of causality, we can ask about counterfactuals, situations that have not been examined before. That's why we seek to characterize it not merely in an associational way, but in a way that depicts hypothesized causality. Ladies and gentlemen, associations result from an underlying data-generating process, and if the data-generating process changes, if we have an intervention or a whole portfolio of interventions, that will often change the associations which are observed. It changes what's observed from the system because we've changed the dynamics by which that data is generated, from which the observations are gained. And in many areas of modern day work, we've benefited from these sort of simulations and models for decades and decades. So I got off on Saturday from a flight which took 14 to 15 hours to fly from Vancouver, and I would never have dreamed about wanting to go on a flight like that unless the pilot had been trained on all sorts of flight simulators under adverse weather conditions. It would be unthinkable to pilot a plane with hundreds of people unless they had experienced flying through thunderstorms, flying under adverse wind conditions, precipitation conditions, using flight simulator. It would be a fit of madness to do that in a real plane, but at least to be able to give them lots of intuition for how a plane behaves under these adverse weather conditions would help put them in a position of safety for piloting a real plane. And so we've relied on flight simulators for decades and decades. Climate simulators for discussing impacts of climate change, plant simulators for large-scale power and process plants, driver training, street design, coordination of construction projects. Simulations have penetrated very deeply into many areas of engineering and in fact, decision making in many domains. And in health, they are reasonably new. I first started, in the health policy space nearly 20 years ago, and it was a very different world then, and simulation models were new and outre. These days, they are being aggressively pursued by many national bodies and provincial bodies as ways of improving decision making, not to replace traditional tools, but to complement them. And the view here that I want to articulate is very important, and I'm going to come back to it throughout this week because I think it's very, very important to help us understand this perspective. You will find simulation modelers who might give courses like this who will have very different views of how simulation fits in. And I'm not going to claim that this speaks for the community as such. But the idea here is of simulation models serving as what Jeff called, and I love that term, and adopted it. I turned the learning prostheses, or learning tools, Jeff calls them thinking or learning prostheses. And I didn't fully appreciate this until I broke I broke my foot a couple of years back and sprained my ankle, and I had to go around on crutches and cane for a little bit, and then a big boot. And I didn't really understand the full implications of this. So a prosthesis helps us complement our limitations, help us achieve full functionality despite built-in limitations that we suffer, right? So I have a broken foot. Using a crutch, I can still get around, still get to my classes, and move about, achieve some degree of mobility despite my limitation. And so it is with models. We have, ladies and gentlemen, a well-documented and a shockingly large set of limitations when it comes to reasoning about complexity. In the savannas of Africa, we simply were not effectively shaped to think with clarity about the dynamics of complex systems. Our ancestors had different quarries in mind, for better or for worse. Those that were thinking about complex systems may not have enjoyed the benefit of achieving successful progeny. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a big limitation there. And in today's world, which has extended well beyond the savannas of Africa, we are facing problems which are complex in nature, profoundly complex, entangled, interrelated. And in order to allow us to survive in that environment, we need the equivalent of crutches that I needed for my foot. We need something that will complement our limitations, help us achieve a requisite level of success and functionality despite those limitations. And that thing is often a simulation model. It helps us operate at a high level despite our own personal limitations. The computer complements our limitations, in short. And they help us learn more quickly by helping us think through the implications of our assumptions more quickly, thoroughly, and consistently, reliably, and rigorously. Let me repeat that again. These models help us learn from empirical evidence, I'll fill that in, more quickly, more thoroughly, and more consistently than we could do just in our head. This allows us to put whatever empirical evidence we have to better, more complete, and effective use. It's not a crystal ball. It's not a guaranteed thing. It's not something which is a silver bullet. You can use your different metaphors, but it helps us more quickly identify inconsistencies between what we think might be going on in the world and what the evidence suggests. It helps us inform our choices and helps us inform sort of our understanding, including what data we should be collecting. So there's kind of a coevolution here in our thinking. What we think in our mental model is going on, we evolve that over time. We build a simulation model which captures some of the core complexities we believe that are driving in the world. We observe the outputs from that model, and we compare it against empirical evidence, observations, and we refine our model further. We refine this, and then hopefully we'll undertake actions and shape the observations from the world in ways that will help us evolve this model to be more and more capture richer understanding of factors in the world. So a model like this, far from being a crystal ball, is part of a learning environment. It's part of this environment to learn from evidence. And that evidence, while it can be useful without a model, with a model it can help us learn additional things. It can help us identify the inconsistencies with our theories about how the world operates in a way that wouldn't be possible without the model. So simulation models, at the most basic level, they make explicit our mental models of causality for discussion and collective refinement. I mean, even if we didn't have a simulation, we could share, a precisely specified model with each other. But it can go so much more far with a simulation. By running a simulation, we can see, okay, does it jibe with the evidence? And we can ask about what-if situations and ask about cost effectiveness or whether certain interventions are high leverage or robust when compared with others. We can evaluate benefits of restructuring a system in certain ways, understand trends, make sense of evidence that we see, say, what's driving that trend? Is it possible with the chlamydia case? There was one of the most famous sexually transmitted infection researchers in Canada, Bob Brunham at British Columbia Centers for Disease Control. He had a hypothesis for what was causing that rise in number of cases. His hypothesis was provocative. He said basically what's going on is that we are our own enemy, to put it as Pogo did, in the sense that the reason we have that rising number of cases is we are getting so effective at catching cases quickly and treating them quickly that we are treating them before their immune system has developed immunity to the bugs. And we'll treat them with antibiotic, azithromycin or ciprofloxacin or what, flaxacin, and we throw them back into their networks of sexually transmitted infection, and they get it again. They're not immune. We've just put a Band-Aid on the situation. We throw them back in, they get infected, and then they come in and get treated again. So this rising number of incident cases, he hypothesized, were repeat cases from the same individuals representing. But it's hard to examine the degree to which the evidence which he assembled was consistent with the scale of that until you built a simulation model, which we did, and we found that yes, probably what he was saying was going on, but it didn't account for 90% of the growth. It was a small fraction of it. So by itself, that didn't explain it. And that was an important contribution to the discussion. These models can also help us identify key uncertainties where if we just knew this thing, it would make a big difference in terms of understanding which policies are most, which of the policies is most desirable, or understanding where we might be going over the next few years in terms of outcomes. And it can understand classes of context in which the same intervention that's best here might be carried over. And finally, they can be serving as communicational tools. Now, my colleagues at Hopkins, Josh Epstein, and at Pitt, Don Burke, the Dean of the School of Public Health, have articulated dozens and dozens of these uses of simulation models in health, with particular focus on health. And if anyone's interested, they can have a more fulsome list. But that's many of the most central ones. So what are these models? What do they consist of? Well, fundamentally, these models consist of a system which has a state. At any one time, there's some current status of the model. In our case, it consists of a bunch of population of individuals, each of whom has a situation with respect to various health contexts. So in our case, we saw, for example, here's our person, and they have a status with respect to food procurement, another status with respect to weight, and another status with respect to how many meals are in their larder right now of different sorts. Spread out across many, many people in the population. So at a given one time, if you were to freeze that population and ask what's the current situation, you could do so. You could enumerate for each person what state they're in, and for the system as a whole, how many grocery stores are there, how many convenience stores, perhaps what a model Winchell has built, a depiction for each of those stores, how much shelf space is devoted to fresh fruits and vegetables versus other types of products. So in addition to having a state at any one time, the model specifies changes, rules for changes for how that state turns into changes to become the next state. So for our model here, if we go and look here, given a certain level of weight, that a given person has, that leads to energy expenditure via basal energy expenditure, as well as energy expenditure to physical activity of a certain sort. And basically these specify rules, the equations associated with these specify rules that say, given the current situation for this person, how do they change over the next little bit to determine their future state? Same thing here. You'll notice here someone's shopping in a supermarket. After a certain amount of time, we depict them as changing. So after an hour in a supermarket, they will leave. In many models, we'll draw that from a distribution. We wouldn't just put it in there, but we did for the sake of the boot camp where we made this model. So the idea here is that given your current situation, there are certain things that can happen to you. There are certain changes that are more or less likely, and we specify them in the model. Same thing with the rules for their larder. If they have a certain number of meals remaining in their fridge, they will end up choosing appropriately within this little decision diagram and make changes accordingly. So these models specify the current situation, but they also specify how that given the current situation, how is it going to change over the next little bit? And for a system dynamics model, a stock and flow model, how that is specified is a little bit different from a state chart. It's a little bit different from a situation with a decision mechanism. But in all cases, basically, you're specifying, given a certain situation now, how is it going to change over the next little bit in terms of change? The system behavior here is not something we put into the model. I'll contrast this. We can imagine a biostatistical model where we do a regression against some function of time with some covariance associated with that. And there we've assumed a certain functional form of the change over time. We don't have that at all in these models. The behavior of these models over time, just like the behavior of the world, results from an interaction of a bunch of different factors. An interaction here of the individuals with the environment, with the location of convenience stores and supermarkets and their distance from the home. And that interaction, that's what led to those high-level associations we saw between how far they live from a grocery store and their weight, for example. That was resulting from an interaction of all these different factors, okay? Including their preferences, their location of their home, etc. So system behavior is emergent. We don't plug it in. We don't say the model should change in a sinusoidal fashion or something like that. No, it results from the interaction, the entangling of all these factors. And as such, we can't specify the behavior over time in closed form. We can't say the model's going to change as, the average weight of the population will change according to this formula. We can't write that down. At a mathematical level, these are nonlinear systems we are dealing with. And one of the hallmarks of nonlinearity, something going back to Galois, I think, is that for many nonlinear systems, we're simply unable to write something down in closed form that will characterize how the solution to that system, how it will, in this case, change over time. Here we'll often be depicting real-world situation, which is nonlinear, with a model that's nonlinear. What this means is, nonlinearity in the world basically means the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. If you double the size of an intervention, you don't double the gains from it, for example. We lack an ability to specify how it behaves over time. It exhibits counterintuitive behavior. These are implied very commonly by nonlinearity. It has path dependence associated with it. Its change early on has a big impact, perhaps, on how it will evolve down the road. The response to multiple interventions, a portfolio, may be very different than some responses to each in isolation. You can have interventions that work synergistically to combine effects so that the gain is far more than the sum of the benefits of each. You can have cases where it's just additive, or you can have cases where they work at cross purposes and even undermine each other, and the gain is far less than additive. You can get multiple possible outcomes, different possible outcomes depending on the situation or the assumptions, and you can get disproportionate impacts of certain groups within these models. The analogy here I'd like to use for those who are first getting exposed to this are that models are like maps. And this analogy has limits, like most analogies, almost all analogies. It has limits to how far it will go. But humor me for a moment. A model is like a map in the sense that both of them represent something about the world. They represent abstractions, fancy word, but basically it means they represent some distillation of things in the world hiding a lot of details. Models like it depicts something in the world, but it hides a lot of the details that are irrelevant to the purpose at hand. And it's the ability to omit details that makes maps feasible and useful. Most of the people in the room are old enough to remember that we used to drive around with maps sometimes in our car, right? We'd have a map of the city or a map of the state or something like that. Maybe some of us still have maps in our cars. You know, sometimes the phone or the tablet runs out of power. Fortunately, paper doesn't run out of power, you know. Models and maps are both useful because they omit certain details. The only perfect model of the world is the world itself. The only perfect map of the world is the world itself. But instead, we build simplified representations because they're useful for particular purposes. Now, if we built a map of Sydney for the sake of driving, you know, a vehicle, it would be a very different map than for transit use. Very different map than for biking. We might highlight different features for each. Very different map if you were trying to figure out why brownouts were occurring or flooding were occurring in certain areas of Sydney, and you were you know, an environmental engineer or a hydrologist or what have you. You'd use a different map. You'd use a map that showed topography and you know, basins for water collection and gradients, etc. So which details we omit from a map, and yes, from a model, depends on how we wish to use it. What purposes are we going to put it for? And you know, George Box says this quote, the famous statistician George Box, inventor of some wonderful statistical techniques, talks about how all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I've always had a little bit of reservation with the phrasing there, but in its provocative phrasing, it points to some underlying truth that, look, we don't ask for a model or for a map to somehow to view it as it's, you know, it's bad if it doesn't include these extra details. We don't actually want a driving map that has every blade of grass and every tree in Sydney marked. I mean, it would get in the way of our getting the information out of it. And with maps, you know, just like with models, we operate within the sphere of incompleteness very deliberately because it's what allows us to confer value. Okay, and when it comes to agent-based models in particular, as dynamic models, this is a particularly key point because they have such flexibility that we can build all sorts of things into them. But we as modelers need to keep this in mind, that we need to start simple and learn from the model over time to help us judge what needs to be in it. Because otherwise we end up setting ourselves to such a high bar that we'll never get there and will offer very little benefit along the way in terms of guidance, because we're not ready yet to offer that guidance, or we think we're not ready yet. But one caveat here is with models, it's more difficult to ascertain a priori what information should be omitted. And what guides you often in understanding what should be omitted is experiments with the model. So it's important to start with a model that's really simple and start experimenting with it, because you'll be so much more savvy about where it should go. The idea here, and again, I have to credit Jeff's, the sage of Sydney, for his insights. So Jeff, reflecting his remarkable erudition and reading breadth, he alerted me to a quote from Francis Bacon. Do I have it here? Or, okay, this version doesn't have it explicitly. The quote basically stated, and this is what, 1600s, 1500s, it is better, one more quickly secures truth through error than from confusion. Now, talk about a provocative statement. Let me repeat that. It is easier to secure truth through error than from confusion. And that may sound outre, because, you know, saying, how can it be better to be wrong than to be uncertain, skeptical, and you know, just doubtful and confused? What he was pointing at was basically something that these days would be phrased as fail early, fail often, or fail forward, I've heard it phrased as. The idea is, look, try something and learn from it. and you're further along than just saying, well, I don't know what it's going to be, I better not do anything. The idea is, try to advance something and learn early from it. So it's better to be transiently wrong by trying something, experimenting, and seeing if it looks plausible, than to just sort of sit back and say, well, I'm not sure, we're not ready to try anything. With a model, we have a systematic way for replacing confusion by learning. We can try something out, try some representation of what might be the case in the world, and we'll learn something from it. And often then we can refine the model further and refine it further and make progress towards a model that's increasingly more savvy. So the idea is, look, try something, take a stand as a working hypothesis, try putting it into place, seeing what you learn from it, and then improve your game over time. And by supporting this theorizing concerning what's going on there, the model aids in theory building, testing, and refinement. It's not merely a passive crystal ball. It's something that helps us learn more quickly from that evidence. And without the model to make sense of it, you're going to have all this empirical evidence that you're not going to be able to turn into understanding about what's going on out there directly. The model provides that link. And even putting forward a poor model at first often advances knowledge by spotting inconsistencies between our assumptions and the evidence. So a key thing that we're going to spend time on is this issue of model scope here. This is going to be particularly key, ladies and gentlemen, for the issue of data and models. And the question here is going to be, what goes in the model in each of three categories? So when we're thinking about putting together a simulation model, the pieces that go into that, when we think about how does data or how does evidence from the world get incorporated in this model, we think about three types of ways it will get incorporated. And there's been some wonderful work by John Sterman at MIT in sort of articulating this in one of his books called Business Dynamics. That is broader than its title would suggest. Basically, we distinguish between three types of representation. The first is things that are endogenous. Here, we represent something in the model in a way that the model generates it. Josh Epstein at Hopkins speaks about the generative hypothesis. The idea being, as he puts it, we don't truly understand something until we can generate it without presupposing it. Okay, and I'm not going to go into that here. It's an interesting thread of the literature, and you may find it interesting to peruse sometime. But the idea here is endogenous factors are factors calculated by the model. Let's consider that model we looked at earlier. Here, someone's weight and its evolution over time is endogenous. We don't tell it to the model. We don't say, at time 33, their weight should be X. At time 34, their weight should be Y. The model's generating this based on their exposure in terms of energy intake, which depends on what meals they eat and which places they obtain those meals, which depends in turn on their preferences for convenience stores and the location of their home. And the model is generating their weight in kilograms over time, right? Generating their weight over time. The model is also generating their exposure to certain food environments over time, shopping, convenience store, and supermarket. It's probabilistic. It's based on their preference and distances, and which one they go to will depend on a probabilistic roll of the dice, reflecting those things. But it's not something we're telling it what to assume. This person goes 75% of their time to the convenience store and whatever to the supermarket. If we did that, it would be rigid. We wouldn't be able to look at interventions which add grocery stores or add convenience stores or change where parks are located or what have you if we hard-coded a lot of these things. So one of the benefits of endogenous things is we can change things and have the model respond accordingly. So we can change, for example, our assumption about grocery store locations. Talk about filling in a food desert, an area which doesn't have good fresh fruits and vegetables, with stores that do offer that, and ask how would that ripple through to their weight change. So these are aspects of endogenous things. The model's telling it to us. We're not telling it to the model. The model generates these things. The model produces these things. They're emergent features of the model in a loose sense. We can use different words that describe it, but basically they're things the model calculates. Those are endogenous things. And those are a lot of things in our model. And often, those are the things that we want to be able to examine under counterfactual situations that they need to be involved in the causal pathways to calculate, because we want to ask what-if questions that will change what those things are, and the model calculates how would they be different under these cases. But a second set of things are exogenous things. These are things the model needs to know about, but it doesn't calculate them. We tell it to the model. Endogenous things, the model tells us how it changes over time. Exogenous things, we tell to the model what to assume. So maybe we're not going to change, for the sake of our model, parks. Maybe we're going to be thinking about adding in supermarket locations, but parks and convenience stores we're going to assume are fixed. Maybe the road network is fixed. We're not thinking about adding bike trails to health food stores or something like that. Where that's a fixed thing. Those are exogenous features. The model's making use of all sorts of data about where the roads are, where they go, how fast you can go on them, all that sort of stuff. It's using information about where the convenience stores are, where the parks are. It's lots of information, but it's not calculating them over time. It's consuming that information over time and using it to shape the model. Does that make sense? At a deeper level, I mean, there's also like some models, we might be asking, okay, suppose we had campaigns that would try to shift norms and attitudes with respect to eating behavior. In that case, preference for convenience store meals on a part of a person here might be something which would be endogenized. We actually have it vary over time in the model. By contrast, I think in this model right now, those preferences are drawn from a distribution here. They're drawn from essentially a truncated normal distribution. And so, as such, they are pre-specified in the model. They don't change over time in the model. They are exogenous in the model. The distribution associated with people's preferences for floaters and screaming yellow zonkers and pies as compared to oranges and broccoli, spinach. So, ladies and gentlemen, here are exogenous factors we tell to the model. That's a lot of data here. I want to really introduce this point, and I'm going to come back to it again. I'm a big believer in spiral learning. You mention a topic, you come back to it at a deeper level, come back. Here, ladies and gentlemen, exogenous things, this is going to be where a lot of data goes into a model. Put it in, right? GIS databases, for example. Go right in there. Data on people's preferences, strength of preferences as obtained through survey instruments within the population. You put in there, etc. Lots of sorts of data. Large-scale national survey instruments, administrative data, a lot of it goes in there. By contrast, endogenous things, the model's generating those, and we'll be comparing these against evidence that we have. But often that evidence isn't reducible to any one parameter. It's not reducible to any one variable in the model. It's emergent behavior of the model. It's emergent behavior in the world, and we're comparing this data we have about rising obesity rates in children of this age group, or the fact that we see higher levels of processed food use in these groups or in this region of the city. That's something we compare against model predictions. That's not data we've put into the model. It's data we're comparing the model generated predictions against that. We're taking the data produced by the model and we're comparing it against this empirical data. We might use that to challenge the model in sort of a cross-validation standpoint, where we're saying, does it jibe with the empirical evidence? We may use it to build confidence in the model. We may use, in some cases, the model calibrates against this data There's less well-known parameters that are adjusted to best match this empirical data. All those cases might be the case, but the point is we don't put that data directly into the model. The model generates things, we compare it with that evidence, we say, does it jive? How well does it jive? How could it jive better, etc. And much of the learning goes on when there's gaps between these and the empirical evidence that's available. And often, from my experience, a very large fraction of our empirical evidence is of that sort. Not all, you often have a lot here, but a lot of it is up here. A lot of our data is of this sort. And this is why models can help us make use of that data, because it's data about emergent processes in the world, and we can make use of it together with a model in a way that will be hard to interpret, hard to make use of with purely traditional techniques. And the final set of issues here, to which I alluded earlier, are factors that are ignored from the world that might be relevant. We're open to putting them in. Often we consciously omit them to start simpler, or we consciously omit them because we have tested in sensitivity and we don't think that they're likely to be significant enough to put in, or because we're waiting in the wings and we want to start to understand the interaction of these things, and then we'll place them in there. That's, again, starting simple. In some cases, they're ignored because they are clearly seen as being too far afield from what we're interested in. So much of what we'll be talking about in the course of the week is things within the sphere of this. And over time, for a model, we might move things that are here into here. We'll evolve the scope of the model so that more things are produced from the model rather than specified exogenously. Occasionally, we may do the opposite. We find it doesn't really gain us much to have endogenous generation. We'll simplify the model by having exogenous. Sometimes we'll move ignored things into exogenous or even into endogenous. The model is a living instrument. We learn from it. Experimenting with us makes us much more savvy about where things should go, where they need to go, and we'll change this boundary. The model is not, let me repeat this, it's not a crystal ball which if it's wrong it shatters and it loses value. The model is a learning instrument. If we spot inconsistencies between the model and data, it's not to be regarded as a failure of the model so much as a success and the opportunity to learn. It's a success that we wouldn't have secured unless we have a model, a realization that our theory is not consistent with the evidence. It's because we had that theory, we spotted that inconsistency. Because we had the model, we spotted that inconsistency, and we use it to learn in our head how we think about the issue, and in the model, how it's represented. So model is a learning tool here, ladies and gentlemen. Capturing more factors endogenously, we'll talk about this more in a later lecture today. It adds flexibility, investigative power, and sometimes accuracy. It adds generality to the model, but it also requires more time and resources to build and ground, often, not always, and it's more challenging to reason about intuitively in many cases. So a couple key take-home messages here. I don't like to be up here lecturing sort of in a closed loop fashion. We're going to be doing most work in this boot camp interactively, building models together and so on. But I wanted to make sure that a few key take-home messages are conveyed here. Addressing many practical challenges in health is especially hard because they exhibit features of complex systems. They're entangled. The behavior of the whole is different than the parts. They're hard to reason about reliably. Many different factors that define them as complex systems. They exhibit hallmarks of complex systems in the form of feedbacks, nonlinearity, delays, disproportionate heterogeneity, etc. System sciences provides us with tools to represent and reason about the behavior of complex systems. Models, such as those we're talking about, express dynamic hypotheses. They help us capture within a model a working hypothesis or positing how things could work in the world, so about processes underlying behavior in the world. They're not just about observables, they're about the things that underlie those observables. And we talked earlier about those needs with complex systems. on the one hand, reason about what's going on here. You know, is this consistent with my thinking? Where is this going? What's causing this on the one hand, and interventions on the other. And here, I noted at that time that we are thinking, in those questions, we're referring to the underlying behavior of the system, what Jeff calls a critical realist position, as articulated by Tilley and Paulson. Is that right? Yeah. Here, the idea is that we have some processes that we posit as occurring in the world, and we're trying to, in our model, articulate a theory for what those processes might be. These models help us address, questions about what's going on here and how interventions might affect things. Models are specific to purpose. If I told you I'm going to build a model of, obesity in Sydney, that's not by itself a very meaningful statement, because the question is more what I'm planning to do with the model. What's the purpose of the model? And one of the biggest traps you can get into with models saying, I'm going to build a model of the immune system. Okay, there's no guidance there how deep you're going to go. I mean, it sounds like, okay, it's not complete unless we have everything in it. That's not going to be a very useful model. You want to focus on certain research questions, certain goals of the model. Sometimes the goals are to address research questions or to address practical choices between interventions. In other cases, the goals are actually to bring together stakeholders. The primary goal of this model is to get stakeholders in these very different areas of the system talking together. The prevention folks talking with the health service delivery folks. Think about that. To have the people who are involved in the secondary and primary prevention, as well as the folks involved in treatment, all in the same room, and realizing how they depend on each other and how the work of one is very important to the work of the other, and not to be viewed as sort of merely competing for resources in the form of funding, etc. Models can have many purposes, and a lot of them are scientific or pragmatic for decision making, but some of them sometimes are sociologic in nature. And you will find the modeling space has literatures for addressing those very different needs. And if you try to read the modeling literature from the perspective only of a research scientist, or only of a policymaker, only of a person who's focused on bringing stakeholder groups together, you will find yourself perplexed, because the model goals are different, and the model and the processes tend to be different. And then finally, multiple and hybrid modeling types are complementary for addressing complex decision-making challenges. We saw that in the model earlier, where we had under the same roof here, if I may, a system dynamics model, a stock and flow model, and a tradition of agent-based modeling together with this sort of decision component. And later we'll see a little bit of discrete event modeling as well. So key take-home messages, okay? It's been a whirlwind tour. What time is lunch, Jeff?
12:30, and it's 1:15.
Okay, so that's good to understand. So I'm going to stop this, and maybe I'll